So if you know me, you know that I'm not very product focused. I don't really push a particular way of doing things. I'm really more process centered. But, every once in a while, there are certain tools or certain strategies that come along that I think are worth explaining, are worth unpacking to help people understand, could this fit somewhere in the overall tool chest of what you use when you are planning for retirement, when you're looking at the tools for retirement. And when we look at the tools of retirement, if you've looked at some of the previous videos, there are tools for liquidity, having available money. There are tools for income, creating predictable or guaranteed income. There are tools for growth. And there are tools for protection. So I want to look today at a particular tool for growth that I think will probably be new to a lot of individuals that may not have heard of what are called buffer annuities. The fact is that they are more recent. They haven't been around longer than maybe a decade and a half. And because I am a registered investment advisor, I became aware that there is a particular class of these buffer annuities that are very unique in that they are completely and totally liquid, totally available to take money out whenever the need arises, which is very, very, very different than most annuities. Annuities generally equal surrender costs or surrender periods. There are no, that I'm aware of other than this, liquid annuities. So that's why I was so excited. I thought it would make sense to just unpack and talk to you a little bit more about how these work, buffer annuities. So below here, I want you to think of, there are 3 decisions that you make in terms of how this is going to work for you. So you choose a time segment, and the time segments they have are 1, 3, and 5 years. Now keep in mind, these time segments do not refer to how long you have to hold the investment. They do not refer to surrender periods. They're just simply referring to what I would call crediting periods. What's the time period until an actual credit of interest or gains gets applied to the account? After 12 months, after 36 months, after 60 months, 1, 3, 5 years. Number 2 is the market segment. So you'll have a choice of how you want to divide up the money inside of the account. And for the 1-year time segments, there are quite a number of market segments you can use. Large cap, small cap, international. There are probably 8 to 10, even possibly more different segments of the market that you can use in the 1 year. When you get into the 3 year and when you get into the 5 year, then you're mostly just the large cap, small cap, and international. You can divide it up in whatever percentages you want. But here's where the unique part of the buffer annuity comes in. And that's the final decision. That is, how much protection do you want during that particular time period? So the company will actually buffer, or they will actually take the loss of the first 10% or 20% or 30% of that particular time segment. So let's take a look at an example so that you can kind of get an idea of how this might work. Let me pull up my pen and my whiteboard here so that I can, I'm gonna use an example of a 3-year segment. I'm going to divide the money, let's say 40% large cap, 40% small cap, 20% international, and I'm going to choose a 10% buffer. So let's say this is our first time horizon here. Okay, now I kind of did these different returns here on the basis of typical 1 year returns, or the kind of the range of returns of 1 year. So I may revise these because we're going a full 3 years. And there's one other piece that we need to introduce in order to totally understand how this works, is we need to introduce the concept of what's called a cap, and that's the maximum amount of growth or interest that would be credited during a different time period. So let's use an example. Let's say that the large cap over a 3-year time period will credit up to 50% growth over the 3 years. Let's say the small cap will do the same. And let's say that the international will do the same, just for easy tracking. All right, and let's since we're going 3 years on this, let's revise this. I was going to do the 1 year to show how the 1 year works, but I wanted to show instead the 3 year. So we're going to create some different time periods of what kind of returns might we see over 3 years, both positive and negative. So let's give an example. Let's say over the first 3 years, the 3 year, let's say it returned a total of 40% positive. So at the end of the 3rd year, now keep in mind, I could take a withdrawal here if I wanted to, or I could take a withdrawal here if I wanted to, or I could take a withdrawal here if I wanted to. Anywhere along the way, if I needed money, I can take it out, no penalty. But let's say at the end of the 3 years, this is a 3-year time segment, let's say it went up by 40%. And let's say my cap was 50%. So I would get all 40% growth credited to my account. Let's say it was $100,000. At the end of the 3 years, I'm going to be at $140,000. Okay, but there are 3-year periods of time where it could go down over 3 years. Let's say in this particular case, after a full 3 years, let's say that the account went down a total of 8% over good times, bad times, and everything. The full 3-year period was negative 8%. I have a 10% buffer. That means that the company is going to absorb the first 10%. So what's going to happen? I am going to not lose any money. So they took the first 10%, and I didn't go over 10%. So in this particular case here, even though it didn't get to beyond the buffer, so at the end of this 3-year period, I kind of gained everything in the first 3 years, didn't lose anything in the second period. Let's say in this particular case, let's say it goes over the max. Let's say it goes up by 70% over this 3-year time period. Well, what's my max? Is 50%. Let's say that this is the cap here. Well, I am going to be limited to gaining 50% over that 3-year period of time. So I'm going to add $70,000 to the account during the time. I didn't get the full benefit of 100% of the growth because there was a cap. Now keep in mind that these caps, each time there's a new time period, the caps can change. So the caps could go up, they could go down. Generally speaking, they're going to kind of stay within a particular range, but the company does have that prerogative to change that. Let's say in my next section, let's say that it goes down, just so that for illustrative purposes, let's say it goes down 11%. Okay, for the full 3 years. Well, my buffer's 10%, so what's going to happen? I'm just going to lose 1% of my money during that 36-month time period. So I'm going to lose $2,100. There. So I think you're kind of getting the idea here. You've got segments. These are the segments that you can choose. The time period after which you'll get the calculation or the credit. You got the market segments you can choose between. You can divide those up however you want. And you've got the buffer. What percentage likelihood? Now, you might say, well, obviously, I'm going to choose the 30% buffer rather than the 10% buffer. Well, keep in mind the cap. So if you're going to take the 10% buffer, caps are going to be higher. If you take the 20% buffer, caps are going to be diminished a little bit. And if you take that 30% buffer, then those caps are going to be even less. So you have to keep in mind that there is a correlation between how much risk you take on and the kind of the risk and the reward, the gain and the loss. So because these are, as we said, fully liquid, there's no surrender fees if you want to withdraw money in between these time horizons or time segments. And from the standpoint of cost, then you're going to have a 1% annual fee that's going to be deducted from the account in order to provide compensation for the advisor. So that's about average in terms of the types of growth types of assets or accounts that you'll use. But it's very unique in the sense that it's a fully liquid investment that allows us to capture a much higher cap rate. If you're using an annuity in order to safely grow money, then it's very, very difficult to get high cap rates. Like currently, say for example, you were using a typical non-buffer annuity. You might have a cap rate, like an annual cap rate. Let's say we got a non-buffer. The cap for a year might be, they might allow you to participate in, let's say, 5 to maybe 7%. That would be extremely generous. But the 1 year on the buffer accounts, depending on which market segment you're in, it can be pretty generous. It can be, I've seen it between 8 and 15. Depending on the particular market segment. So it can be almost twice as much as the non-buffer. So it's much more generous. Keep in mind that the annuities that are used for accumulation, like the indexed annuities, let's call them indexed. That's the normal accumulation vehicle. Those are not liquid. They usually have a surrender cost. They can go from 7 to 10 years, whereas the buffer annuities are liquid. So have lower caps. And buffer, we got higher caps. So definitely something that is a uniquely new, within the last decade and a half, 2 decades, idea related to ways to accumulate money. So if you have questions about this, how this works and how this might look in any particular situation, or how you mix and match this, kind of the results, I've done a good amount of research on kind of the long-term returns of using buffer annuities over long time periods, like a decade or so, and how they compare in regard to risk and return to other types of assets. So definitely something to consider, and let me know if you have questions about how these work.